Good morning, goddammit. Fucking optimizing your natty high intensity program. All right, let's get into it. First things first is frequency. Frequency is something we're massively overlooking in high intensity sphere, especially because the two biggest dudes that we listen to are Mike Mentzer and Dorian Yates. Genetic freaks on steroids who've been training for a very long time, maxing out all the stats. Of course, these guys don't need as much frequency. When you're natural, not only do you need more frequency because you need more bout effects of protein synthesis because you're not enhanced, you can get away with more frequency because you're not as strong. Thus, your central nervous system, your connective tissues, and your muscles aren't as taking as much damage. I mean, the muscle damage may be a little bit relatively equal between the two, and maybe if you're on steroids, you can get away with recovering from the muscle damage quicker. But as far as frequency goes, you don't need as much frequency, and nor can you probably get away with as much frequency when you're on steroids. Otherwise, you blow connective tissues and feel like shit all the time because you're fucking Dorian Yates incline pressing 200 kilos. He went on to Terry's tricep, Terry's bicep, shoulders are all fucked. Whereas when you're natural, you can get away with more frequency and you need it. Massive misconception in high intensity training is that you need to train every 7 to 10 days, bro, because Mike Mentzer said so. Well, there's a whole bunch of fucking science that's been missed out in the last 25 years since, Dorian Yates, the last was, longer than that, 96 or whatever it was. It's been almost 30 years since Dorian Yates was doing bodybuilding. Exercise science has progressed significantly since then. So there's a bunch of different things I want to go over in this video that pertains to naturals especially, but just high intensity in general. If you like high intensity, and then you're on steroids even, there's going to be a bunch of different things that you can optimize your programming with this video. So natty or not, this shit's going to help. Basic math and muscle protein synthesis. So the basic math of it is if you can do 2 chest days a week, you're going to do 104 chest days in a year. Whereas if you can only do 1 chest day a week, you're only going to do 52. Which one's getting better gains? Certainly the guy doing 104, especially if you're natural, because you don't have that height in protein synthesis. Protein synthesis probably only lasts for about 36 to 48 hours in general. After that, you are shrinking. Muscles do not exist within sort of a maintenance state. You're either in anabolism or catabolism. You're either growing or you're shrinking. To what rate? Probably higher on the growing than you are shrinking. But regardless, if let's say arbitrary number wise, Monday you do chest, by Wednesday the anabolism is over, the protein synthesis is over. Let's say you added 3% muscle, say arbitrary number. By next Monday, in that period from Wednesday to Monday, you will have spent 4 days atrophying because you will not be in anabolism anymore. Will you lose a fuck ton of muscle and be in maintenance? Probably not, but you might be depending on who you are. But let's say you add 3% muscle, and then the 4 days of catabolism, you lose 1.5% muscle mass. Well, you only got 1.5% gain instead of 3. This is mathematically inferior. So if you can get away with more frequency and still recover from it, you're going to get better gains in a shorter amount of time. Next one's muscle fiber types. If you are type 2 dominant, probably don't need as much frequency and you're gifted. On average, we're about 60 to 40% fiber types, but from muscle to muscle, this can change. You might find within your triceps, you're extremely type 2 fiber dominant, genetically gifted triceps or genetically gifted muscle part, whereas a lot of us in the calves are type 1 fiber dominant. And thus, these muscle fibers can take a significant amount more damage. They have much more damage resistance, and thus they can do more, not only do more volume and high intensity, you can probably get away with 2, maybe even 3 sets to failure and still not overdo it. You can also probably get away with more frequency. So understand that on a whole, you might have slightly more fiber type 1 dominance. Unfortunate, but at least then you can then get away with more frequency due to the fact that they are more damage resistant. Whereas if you have very type 2 dominant fibers, well, it's likely that muscles are genetically gifted and you don't give a fuck about the frequency. In my case, I have genetically gifted triceps, thus fiber type 2 dominant as fuck in that area. I probably don't need to do more than 1 day of triceps a week. Also, there's indirect stimulus, which I'll go into in a second. But in the case of my calves, I need 2 to 3 times a week stimulus with sets to failure rather than just 1 set to failure to make optimal gains. If I just did 1 set to failure on my calves once a week, like a Dorian Yates or a Mike Mentzer would suggest, my calves would not grow. I've done it before and they didn't grow. As soon as I switched to more sets, more frequency in this type 1 fiber dominant muscle of mine, I made far more fucking gains. My calves grew 1 inch in a month And it wasn't inflammation because it stayed that way for 3-4+ months after that. So muscle fiber types, consider that if you have a genetically weak point or you are training something that is type 1 dominant like forearms or calves, you might need more frequency. The next point is indirect stimuli. So this is another point very similar to my previous point, where some muscles get a shit ton of indirect stimulus, triceps being one of those. When you do any sort of pressing exercises, you're doing plenty of indirect stimulus, which allows for that myofibrillar protein synthesis to be heightened throughout the week. Because if you do chest on Monday and then hit shoulders on Thursday, your triceps had indirect stimulus that carries that protein synthesis over. Also, you then can't recover from that much tricep work because you're doing so much indirect stimulus. Whereas the calves, there is very minimal, if any, indirect stimulus throughout the week. Thus, you want to probably directly hit them throughout the week. Traps might be another one. You might not hit the traps too hard on back day, but then biceps, you hit plenty indirect stimulus on back day. So some muscles will be indirectly stimulated massively, not so much, and not at all. And thus, you then have to act accordingly based off the muscle fiber type and how much indirect stimulus. Again, the calf is a perfect example of this. No indirect stimulus unless you're doing, athletics, etc. And it's type 1 dominant for most people. You're gonna have to do more frequency. You can't listen to Dorian and Mike and whoever the fuck about that one when they're genetically gifted guys on steroids who have protein synthesis through the wazoo and type 2 dominance within that muscle group. Next one, central nervous system fatigue. Very simple one here. Best example I could give is fuck deadlifts, do a hamstring curl. You can do hamstring curls twice a week to failure, more than likely, due to the fact that it isn't a super heavy, super compound exercise. And on top of that, you can actually train the hamstring to failure as opposed to the deadlift where likely the failing point is your lower back and abs. And thus, deadlifts shit for hypertrophy, can't do it twice a week to failure, won't allow you to train your hamstrings to absolute mechanical failure as it will be something else. Whereas the hamstring curl, you can do to failure safely without motor unit recruitment issues due to, having to learn the technique first or whatever. And you can do it more frequently. So choose your exercises carefully. Don't do massively fatiguing exercises that require a bunch of skill and use a shit ton of different muscles in an unstable fashion that's unsafe, as it will fatigue also your connective tissues, etc. So central nervous system fatigue, choose exercises, rep ranges, etc. that give you the same stimulus, if not likely quite a bit better, but it then allows you to go with more frequency. Perfect example being the deadlift, or perhaps maybe a arse to grass hack squat instead of an arse to grass free-weighted barbell squat, as the free-weighted barbell squat will bring a lot more stabilizer muscles and technical requirements into it and more central nervous system fatigue. Due to that, you're better off than just doing the hack squat, which will allow you to train to failure safer with the quads being the limiting factor and the central nervous system not taking as much fatigue. Next point, smaller muscles. So smaller muscles recover from muscle damage quicker. Muscle damage is not how you grow, it's by fibrillar addition. And therefore, you want to mitigate as much muscle damage as you can through a whole host of things I'm going to talk about and I already talked about. But on top of that, if a muscle is smaller, it recovers quicker because there's less tissues to recover over time. If there's, fucking 500,000 fibers damaged as opposed to 10 million or whatever, arbitrary numbers, it's going to recover quicker. So smaller muscles are less metabolically, expensive. Forearms, neck, say calves in my case, they're quite fucking small. This is part of why naturals can get more frequency too, because they get less muscle damage because they have smaller fucking muscles. Anyway, digressing. Forearms, neck, calves in my case, chest in my case, will probably recover from muscle damage quicker, and therefore you can get back into the training. But also, smaller muscles can't produce as much force, and therefore the tendons aren't going to be broken down as much, and because they can't produce as much force, they're not as fatiguing for the central nervous system. So calves, forearms, neck, smaller muscles can probably be done with more frequency, so long as there's not a bunch of indirect stimulus, and so long as they're not super type 2 dominant, which a lot of those muscles aren't anyway. So smaller muscles can do more frequency, forearms, calves, etc. Next one, connective tissues. I've already kind of beaten this one, but again, if you know, your connective tissues are hurting, or you're just doing a bunch of fucking frequency on heavy compound movements or movements that are just heavy in general, or on connective tissues that are a bit more risky, like biceps tendons, for example, as opposed to a glute tendon insertion, then you've got to be a bit more cognizant, because it can be very easy to get bicep tendonitis or tendinosis, whereas getting fucking lat tendonitis, very unlikely. So that's another thing. Biceps are a small muscle, but then there's more compartmentalization in the sense that it's small muscle that recovers quick, but it has a cunty tendon, and it gets a bunch of indirect stimulus from back training. So there's all these things you have to weigh up, and once you weigh them up, you're golden, but you have to consider them first, connective tissues being one of them. Shitty tendons or problematic tendon areas being pecs, biceps, triceps to an extent, calves, not so much, quads maybe, hamstrings a little bit more. So you've got to also consider these things, but general rule of thumb is if you're not experiencing tendonitis or tendinosis or any joint achy pains, then you're probably golden. I mean, obviously you also got ligaments. Typically ligaments don't really get stressed as much for training unless you're doing a fuck ton too much though. Typically tendons will start fucking with you first, unless you're doing really shitty form with bad, you know, momentum and whatever. But connective tissues in general, if your connective tissues in your joints feel okay, then you're doing perfectly fine frequency, so long as you're also progressively overloading. Now, last point is just sort of a general fatigue management strategy. Use 5 to 8 reps, not 12 plus. So 12 plus being higher rep ranges. There is no reason to go past 8 reps, as for one, higher reps create more fatigue, more metabolic stress, more muscle damage in turn. Metabolic stress is not a real driver of hypertrophy, so very little. It's a backseat driver of sorts. And in general, it's harder to become or train to failure when you go onto higher rep ranges, as cardiovascular fatigue will be likely the thing that stops you from being able to do 20 reps to failure on a fucking squat. If you can do 20 reps squats to mechanical failure, good for you, but likely you won't, and you'll perceive failure much earlier than it truly is on in a mechanical sense. And then they just, generally, you have to spend more time recovering from higher reps. It seems, counterintuitive. You'd think higher reps are less fatiguing, but they are more. 5 to 8 is perfect. You also create more mechanical tension quicker and full motor unit recruitment quicker with lower rep ranges. There's no real difference. You could definitely train to failure and get full motor unit recruitment from 15 reps. It's just harder to actually go to failure, and you need more time to recover. The thing you'll miss out on is the pump, but so be it. Sarcoplasmic hypertrophy is not a thing. Mechanical stress doesn't give you gains. It's mechanical tension. It's motor unit recruitment, 5 to 8 reps, perfect for that. Plus, you'll create more joint or tendon stiffness, which will be less likelihood of injury. It's actually higher reps that will create less rigidity of the tendons, which increases injury risk. Just in general, 5 to 8, not so much the higher reps. I mean, if you like high reps or you're injured and you can't do the heavier rep ranges, like with my bicep tear, after the bicep tear, I couldn't do, I couldn't do 5 to 8 reps on bicep curls or back exercises. So it is very much contextual. If you just enjoy it, or maybe you're new to training and you want to feel more of your muscle groups via metabolic stress, then so be it. But in general, if you're more advanced and you can get a good contraction through heavier loads, do it. You'll get away with more frequency that way. Now, onto vital considerations. So frequency out of the way, we have vital considerations. This will work wonders whether you're natural or you're on gear. It doesn't really matter. These are just new age, high intensity things we should be adding in that hasn't been considered as much. First one is exercise selection. Most muscles don't need 4, 5, 6 fucking exercises to hit them. In the case of the biceps, you need 2. You need a supinated bicep curl and then a pronated bicep curl to hit the bicep brachii and then the brachioradialis and the brachialis. You don't need fucking 5 different bicep exercises that are redundant and creating more stress and fatigue on that bicep and that area and general supraspinal central nervous system fatigue. You don't need all that shit. You don't need a fuck ton of leg exercises. A squat, a leg extension maybe, a hamstring curl, a calf raise. You don't need 5 different squat variations and all this shit that are redundant. They do all the same things. Choose your exercises wisely, and then just do one set to failure, or maybe even 2 sets depending on the exercise or the muscle group, and you're golden. If you do too many exercises, it will only cut into your recovery, and you won't be getting any more gains, you'll be getting less gains. Then you also want to choose exercises that are just, in general, whether you're doing volume or high intensity, make more sense for the area. Calves, you should probably do stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Biceps, probably want to do stretch-mediated hypertrophy. Lats, probably not. Probably look for the mid-range. Chest, probably a bit of both to get the adaptations that you get from the stretch-mediated hypertrophy, but then generally just maintain that after the fact. But certain, muscles that are monoarticular that don't get fucking stretch-mediated hypertrophy, like the delts, don't do stretch fucking delt positions. It's just not going to do anything for you at all. This doesn't matter whether it's high intensity or not. This is just a secondary consideration, is understand the biomechanics and choose the exercises accordingly. And don't do like these massively full range of motion exercises that are redundant, like adding extra range to a movement for no fucking reason other than to create more fatigue, which means you can't get as much frequency. Next one is numerous sets to failure. So this is another one where it's got to be considered for the frequency you're doing, and then the muscle you're doing. Triceps, you do not need multiple sets to failure. It's a smaller muscle group, gets a bunch of indirect stimulus. It's just, you don't need that much for the triceps. 1 set to failure once a week, maybe twice a week if you really want to or can get away with it. But in the case of, again, the calves, numerous sets to failure, that's a bueno idea. That's a good idea. Maybe you have a muscle where you have a hard time recruiting full motor unit recruitment. It's just a muscle that's having a hard time really activating. Maybe the back, maybe the glutes, posterior, maybe a muscle that has less proprioception or pain receptors, maybe more sets to failure. This is an individualized thing. General rule of thumb is start higher with the sets, maybe do 2 sets of failure, see if you recover. If not, cool, go down to 1 set to failure. And if you can do 1 set to failure once or twice a week rather, then great. Because 2 sets to failure once a week is inferior to 1 set to failure twice a week, as you get that repeated myofibrillar protein synthesis. But then on top of that, that second set has significantly less motor unit recruitment and therefore is inferior to that stretched out set later in the week. Next one is rep tempo. So understand that Dorian Yates and Mike saying that the eccentric is where you get the gains is wrong. The eccentric is where you get the muscular damage, which is not where you get the gains. It's where you get more recovery requirement. Now, granted, don't do no speed on your eccentric. You need some control in order to not hurt yourself and just get general standardization. But in general, you get less mechanical tension on the eccentric because you are stronger, and therefore you get less motor unit recruitment. And so it's the concentric that you're really looking for. So this is a big high intensity training sort of misconception, is the eccentric is what you want. No, the concentric is what you want. Concentric failure is what you want. And then going to failure beyond that by like doing a slow negative is just fucking more muscle damage to recover from that doesn't mean shit. So rep tempo, I think it depends. Are you injured? By all means, then maybe do like a 5 second up, 5 second down, super slow way of doing things. But in general, I'd say 1 second up, controlled explosion, and then a 2 second negative, just to keep everything safe, would be the best bet. But this time and attention, slow rep stuff, if you're not injured or doing, an exercise that is a little bit risky or whatever, maybe like in my case, I don't want to do normal speed bicep curls anymore because I'm paranoid about bicep tears after tearing it in jiu-jitsu. So I'd happily do 5 second rep tempo on that one. But in general, rep tempo is just to stay safe. In general, you're just looking to fail on the concentric. Next one is mental excitation. Huge. This is something that I didn't understand for a long time. People would watch Dorian Yates and say, man, he trains so intensely. I'm like, so do I. I train at failure. I train even more intense at one point. I was doing fucking drop sets and rest pauses and all this shit, redundant shit, but I was doing that shit because Mike Mentor said so. And I was like, fuck, I don't get it. He's fucking, how's he so much intense? Well, what it really is he's more mentally intense because of, him being Dorian Yates and being on fucking Anadrol pre-workout and shit. But what that does is allows for more motor unit recruitment, more muscle fiber, recruitment, and thus more gains. So one of the best examples of this would be Eric Bugenhagen when he was natural, if he's ever been natural, I don't know. when he was natural in like 2017 for sure, one of the things I think that was so beneficial for him and made him such a freakishly large natural outside of his, freakishly good genetics is the fact that he had this mindset of just going in and being fucking crazy with it. And he would get full motor unit recruitment on his 1 rep maxes during his Bulgarian training. Got good gains from it because he was fully using every ounce of his muscles and his motor units. So understand that if you're not mentally ready or excited enough, you're not going to be producing as much force, and you're not going to be getting as much motor unit recruitment, not as much mechanical tension, and you won't get as much gains. Especially if you're really going for the one set to failure stuff, you need full motor unit recruitment. You don't have numerous sets to keep going up to those high thresholds. So get mentally excited, listen to good tunes, drink coffee beforehand. You don't have to be an adrenalized fucking meth junkie, fucking freak going crazy in the gym like, Dorian Yates or an Eric Bugenhagen, but definitely be there and ready to go hard because you won't get as many gains otherwise. Next one is progressive overload and your joints. So this is kind of going back to the frequency thing, but generally push as much frequency and volume as you can. If you are progressively overloading and your joints feel good, you're golden. That's the general way of looking at high intensity training. Push as much as you can, as much frequency as you can, as much volume as you can. Don't do as much intensity as you can. Don't just keep doing, drop sets and rest pauses and shit like that. But volume and frequency, push it as much as you can. As soon as progressive overload or your joints start feeling like shit, then back it up. Simple as. Such a simple way of looking at it, but people overcomplicate their shit. I'm doing it right now, but I'm trying to give you as many percentages as you can to add up to your high intensity training to make you as jacked as possible. This one's more of an off-topic one, but don't fuck around with your diet. If your diet's shit, you won't get as many gains from any form of training, let alone high intensity training that's very, fucking demanding on your body. So if your micronutrients are off, your protein's off, your carbs are off, if your carbs are off, you're fucked, your fats are off, anything is off, it's going to be pretty hard to train with intensity and then recover from high intensity programming and with any decent amount of frequency. You won't have as much mental excitation because you're just feeling like shit and lethargic. You won't be progressively overloading. Your joints will feel like shit because you're deficient in collagen and gelatin and proteins. So don't fuck around with your diet, otherwise you might get injured, you won't get the gains, and you won't be training as good. Last point is programming different splits. You can do different splits other than the standard, fucking chest, triceps, back, biceps, legs, day off shoulders, Dorian Yates style, or the Mike Mensa push-pull legs or whatever. You can do full body, you can do upper lower, you can do a bunch of different things. But you have to split up the exercises throughout the week. For example, push-pull legs, can't do it. You can do push-pull leg because you can't train legs twice a week when you're already doing fucking 4 other workouts through that week. You need a day in between. Doing a push-pull and then not taking a day off before legs is going to be very difficult and you're probably not going to recover from it, especially if you're advanced. Then understanding that there's a bunch of indirect stimulus there on the push day, the next push day would have to be shoulders. And if you want to hit the chest again, you can only do 1 set just to get that protein synthesis to run over into the next week, as I was speaking on earlier. You might have to understand that you have to do reps in reserve on certain things. So the push day on Monday is chest focused and you take it to failure, but then the push day later in the week that is shoulder dominant, the second time you do your chest stimulus, it's 1 to 2 reps in reserve so that you don't overtrain, and it's just to simply carry over that protein synthesis to the next chest day. So there's a bunch of different things in programming different splits you have to consider, but I just gave you all the different things to consider throughout this video that will allow you to program the way you want to program. You could do full body 2-3 times, maybe even a week, if you know how to program high intensity 3 times a week. It is possible. You could do 1 leg exercise on Monday, say a quad dominant one in a squat. Then on Wednesday, you would do a hamstring curl and a Bulgarian split squat for glutes and hamstrings. And then by the Friday, you go back to the quads again. And on the Bulgarian split squats, you got a bit of indirect stimulus in the quads on the Wednesday, but it wasn't so much that you couldn't recover for Friday. But there's all these different nuances that if you weigh up and consider, you will get the best gains of your life. Anyway, that's it for today. Peace out, bye.